Have a good day. Appreciate it. There's all this no comment to get a house.
Hello there. Am I in? Participants, no?
Hi, Susan. Yes, you're in the meeting.
Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
So we're going to wait just one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name is Shelly Goehring, and I'm on staff here at MHP, Mass Housing Partnership. Thank you so much for joining us today for this first session of our Housing Trust and CPA conference. So many of you know that we were going to be having a day conference in March, but of course, like every other conference in the spring, it got pushed off. So we've broken it up into 4 sessions. Today, we are focusing on Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, as well as community preservation committees and how those 2 bodies work together. The overall theme for this conference is looking at affordable housing development. So our session next week is looking at affordable housing finance. And one of my colleagues, Ann Lewis from our lending team, will be taking us through a fantastic presentation to teach us about how we finance affordable housing in Massachusetts. And then in the end of January, we have the real estate director from Harbor Light Community Partners on the North Shore working through a development pro forma and teaching us how developers balance the differing interests of communities, of lenders, of the state, and expectations around affordable housing. And then in early February, we have at least 2 communities, Salem and Brewster, will be sharing their real live efforts to support affordable housing development in their communities. So thank you so much for participating today. We are taping this session and each of the sessions. So if you don't want your face taped, then you can just turn your camera off. We hope you'll keep your camera on, but if you want to turn it off, that's fine. And the recording will be put on the Housing Toolbox in the next few days, so it can be accessed down the road as well. We're asking you to keep yourself muted during this session because there are so many of you. And if you have questions, then please put them in the chat. And my colleagues, Katie Bossy and Laura Schufelt, are going to be monitoring your questions. They'll interrupt me if you have clarifying questions initially. If you have other questions, I'm going to stop at different points. I hope to remember, I'm going to try to remember to stop at different points, and they will bring questions forward that, that they think should be answered fully. Otherwise, people can be answering in the chat as well. And one thing I'm wanting you to keep in mind is if you're in a community that has an affordable housing trust, as well as the Community Preservation Act, if you would think about how those boards collaborate in your community, and also put those examples in the chat, because Katie is going to highlight a few of those at the end of our training today, just to give you an idea of how communities are already collaborating. So we're going to start with a poll just to get an idea of how many of you are in communities with affordable housing trusts and or a community preservation committee. So I'm going to launch the poll. So are you able to see the poll, Katie?
Yes, we are.
So if you'll take a minute to answer the 2 questions. 3 questions, I'm sorry. So it looks like that, can people not submit? To use submit is working. This is Lee. To use submit is working. You need to answer all 3. Oh, okay. So I'm sorry. You need to answer all 3, it looks like, before you can submit. If you don't know the answers, don't worry about it. Just answer what you can. Yes, so you do need to scroll down to the bottom. Okay, just a few more seconds, I'm going to end it. Uh-oh. Didn't look like it worked. Huh.
Yeah, Shelly, we can see the results now.
You can?
Yep.
It's really funny because I can't. So do you want to see what the results are?
Sure, yeah, I'll share the results. So there's about 85% of people said yes, they have a Community Preservation Act. 2% are considering, and 13% do not have a Community Preservation Act adopted in their community. For question 2, my community has an affordable housing trust. 60% said yes, 25% said no, and 17% are considering. And then my community has both CPA and trust. It's about exactly 50-50.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much. I can't believe I couldn't see the results. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with MHP, our overarching goal is to increase the supply of affordable housing across the state. So we have essentially 4 legs to our stool, 4 key ways that we do this. We have community assistance team, which I'm a part of, Katie is a part of, Laura Schufelt we are on the community assistance team, and we provide all forms of technical assistance and support to communities, to nonprofits and housing authorities across the state. We have a lending team that's lent over $1 billion to support over 27,000 units of affordable housing. And our niche, really, we focus on affordable rental housing. We have a homeownership team that has the One Mortgage. It's a first-time home buyer mortgage product. It's unique to Massachusetts, the most affordable mortgage for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. And then we have, more recently, the Center for Housing Data. So we have a team of folks who are collecting and synthesizing data and distributing it in user-friendly ways to help to inform housing policy on the local, regional, and state level as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about municipal affordable housing trusts. In Massachusetts, we actually have several communities that have established a trust within the last year. So I'll do a little bit of an overview about trusts because we also have 17% of you that are considering a trust. We'll get into a little bit of just some of the things that we're learning as we spend more time in communities that have affordable housing trusts. So some tips about how to set your board up and how to operate. And then we'll get a little bit into trusts and CPCs and collaboration between the 2 boards and local communities. And there will be some time for Q&A, but again, put your questions in the chat, please. So what is an affordable housing trust? The trust is a public entity, so it's a part of the municipality. It's not separate. It's not a silo. It is a municipal board. It's created by your local legislative board. So this is with a majority vote. The purpose is creating and preserving affordable housing, and it's led by a board of trustees that's appointed locally, not at the state level. It's appointed locally. And because it is a municipal entity, it means that just like your other boards, it's subject to public procurement, to designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws. It's organized under the Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 55C, and this is the language from the statute around the purpose of the trust. It is to provide for the creation and preservation of affordable housing in municipalities for the benefit of low and moderate income households. So it's actually a fairly limited scope. It's about creating and preserving affordable housing. It's not everything. So sometimes communities want a trust to do everything having to do with housing or affordable housing, and that's not really the purpose of a trust. It also clarifies that it's for low and moderate income only, that the purpose of the trust is to create and preserve low and moderate income housing to support low and moderate income households. The statute doesn't define low and moderate income. So one of the steps that we suggest that communities do is to define this for yourself and to be clear about how you are defining low and moderate income. We suggest that your community look at existing programs in Massachusetts and how low and moderate income is defined there. So, or federal. So with HUD and with the subsidized housing inventory in Massachusetts, if you want units to count on the SHI, then 80% of the area median income would be your ceiling. The Community Preservation Act allows 100% of the area median income. So some communities use that as their definition of low and moderate income. The state's Affordable Housing Trust goes to 110% with their low and moderate income definition. So look at existing programs and define that for yourself, for your community, and then be clear about how you're defining low and moderate income. Oops. These are the variety of steps, since there are several of you that are considering establishing a trust. First is to read the statute and determine whether your community is going to consider accepting the statute as it's written, or whether you're wanting to make some clarifications or modifications in that and write your own ordinance or your own bylaw. So once you decide that, then it's the legislative body that accepts the ordinance or just the statute as it's written. Once the vote has been certified, it is sent to the AG's office. The Attorney General has 90 days to review the ordinance or the bylaw and to determine that it falls within state law. At that point, then you can establish your board of trustees. So you can appoint your members. You can record a declaration of trust. This is clarifying the powers and the authority of the trust, particularly if you're wanting to engage in selling or buying property. You set up a trust fund account. This is generally through your municipal treasurer. And then the dark blue are some of our suggestions, and I'm going to get into them a little bit later. So very broadly, an affordable housing trust can intentionally focus on addressing your local affordable housing needs. It can be a board in your community that is exclusively focused on affordable housing. So a benefit is that it doesn't have a variety of topics or things that it's supposed to be becoming experts on. So with the Community Preservation Act, where that board is looking at historic preservation, open space, recreation, and affordable housing, it's difficult for that board to become extremely rehearsed in all four of those topics, particularly when people are being appointed from different areas, different fields. So the trust can have a group of people that are just focused on affordable housing. And this board can help to support local housing initiatives. It can engage in real estate activity. It can buy and sell property. Because the trust doesn't have to go back to town meeting or the city council to make decisions, If the trust is funded, then it means that body can move more nimbly in the real estate market. So if something comes up, if a site or land comes up for sale, either the trust can engage in purchasing it, or the trust can respond to a developer that's interested in purchasing it for the purpose of affordable housing. And then the trust can also collect funds from a variety of different sources, not just CPA, even though that is a significant resource for many communities. The statute specifies that the board must have a minimum of 5 trustees. It must include the mayor in a city or a member of the select board. So the statute doesn't say mayor or an appointee, as a lot of people assume that. It doesn't actually specify that. So we have mayors that are actively involved on affordable housing trusts. And then that members are appointed either by the mayor or by the select board. Terms are for 2 years, a minimum of 2 years. And then the statute does specify that trustees are considered public agents. So they're special municipal employees for those purposes, just as other board appointees are. The statute lists a variety of different powers that are given to the trustees of an affordable housing trust. The statute does allow communities to add additional powers as long as they're in line and keeping with the statute. It also allows communities to modify powers or limit powers. We encourage communities to be cautious about limiting the powers too much, because you don't want to detract from some of the key reasons of why you would want to create an affordable housing trust to begin with. But there are communities that perhaps they might want a 2/3 vote of trustees to purchase property, or some communities might want the select board to review a decision to borrow funds. So a community could modify the powers a bit. And just one example, this is the city of Beverly. They created an affordable housing trust in early 2017. They appointed their 5 members. So their board has 5 members. Their mayor is on the board and he's actively involved. Their planning and community development director is on their board. The municipal finance director is on the board, and then 2 residents at large. This is the only community that I know of where the majority of their trustees are actually municipal employees. But several communities have at least 1 municipal employee on their board. For their powers, they did put one limit, that the conveyance of real property requires the mayor and the city council approval. And their funding so far have been inclusionary zoning in lieu of payments, and they will potentially have CPA funds in the future and other resources. Once they created their trust, they appointed their members, and then they completed their updated housing plan. So they have over 10% on the subsidized housing inventory. Over 10% of their housing is deemed affordable by the state. And they completed their plan. So they didn't need a housing production plan with the state, but they wanted to have current data before they got started. So they finished their plan. The trustees spent time reviewing that plan, really understanding the housing needs in the community. And then they developed guidelines for their housing trust. They identified that based on the needs, the kinds of activities that they were interested in funding. They created a process for reviewing, accepting applications, reviewing applications, and then how they were going to fund projects. At the end of the year, they released a NOFA, a notice of funds available, to engage developers, to invite developers and other entities to request funds. And then their first projects were funded the next year in 2018. We're encouraging communities, when you do start a trust, to do this kind of thoughtful planning. Really think through what the structure is going to be. How are you going to be engaged in the community? What do you see your goal and your purpose? And then to get started with distributing funds. Oftentimes communities create a trust and they don't spend time doing this groundwork. And we oftentimes see communities kind of spinning their wheels because it's complicated and the needs are great. And doing this kind of ground basic work, really understanding your role in the community, seems to be helpful.
Shelly, do you mind if we pause here and answer some statute questions we have coming in?
Yes, thanks.
So Alyssa LaRose from FERCog said, does the statute allow for multi-town and regional trust to be created?
So it doesn't specify a structure for that. So Laura might be able to jump in on this. So I'm not sure that it would be allowed under this statute. I don't know if Laura, if you want to say anything different.
I'm not sure. I was just trying to pull up the statute to see what the language was because I haven't, I'll get back and put it in the chat.
Okay, we'll get back to that one. And then another question we had was if a town wanted its trust to go up to a 200% area median income, do you need special legislation with the state to allow this, or is something that can happen at a local level?
So I might defer to Laura as well. There are communities where they have special legislation to identify moderate incomes that high. I think that, I don't know if, I think that it could open a community up to legal challenges if you were to define moderate income at 200% on your own without that support from the legislature. But Laura, do you want to say something different?
No, I agree with what you just said.
And one last question, is there a repository at state level of affordable housing trust bylaws to look at range of controls or formal process?
So we do have a variety of bylaws that, Katie, do we have some on the housing toolbox?
Which tools?
The like bylaws, example of bylaws and ordinances?
I can check, and if so, I'll place them in the chat.
Okay, we definitely have a variety of the examples. So we'll make sure that some are put on the housing toolbox and it'll be near the Affordable Housing Trust section. Thank you. Other questions about the statute or some of the information that we've covered so far? No,
I think that's it. We do have some questions about the trust's role, what they can and can't do, but maybe we'll wait till later when you get into that.
Yeah, let's see if we cover some of that here.
Okay.
So as we're working in more communities and observing trust, it's not really rocket science of what helps trust to be effective. You really need access to funds, to money, have a vision, a strong sense of what your role is in the community, leadership that can help move things forward, and then transparency within the community. So what we're seeing is that communities are becoming much more creative around how they're funding their affordable housing trust. So even though almost 80% of our affordable housing trust communities also have the Community Preservation Act, it's not necessarily a given that the trust is going to receive CPA funds or that those funds are going to be near enough to address the affordable housing at the level that the trust wants to. So CPA, the hexagon, the orange hexagon on the top, is definitely the most common resource. We do have the yellow, inclusionary zoning. There are some inclusionary zoning bylaws or ordinances that allow an in lieu of payment for a developer to pay instead of building a unit. And some of those ordinances or bylaws clarify that any in lieu of payments will be directed to the Affordable Housing Trust. If it's not in the bylaw or the ordinance, then it goes to the general fund and it has to be directed. But we do have trusts that are receiving those funds. We have communities that have transferred free cash, like Truro and Brookline have transferred free cash into their Affordable Housing Trust. There may be special bylaws or ordinance payments that can be directed to the trust. Income from tax title sales could be directed to the Affordable Housing Trust. We have a community, the blue hexagon on the Cape, that has a cell phone tower and their lease payments. That income is directed to their trust. We have seen the first community pass a municipal bond to fund their trust. Medfield created a trust a few years ago and then also passed $1 million bond, and they don't have CPA, so it was not bonded against CPA funds. But they bonded $1 million to help seed their affordable housing trust. And Orleans is the first community that we know of that has done a tax override to fund their trust. So they created an affordable housing trust, accepted it 2 or 3 years ago at this point. And then they also put on the ballot, and it passed at the ballot easily, a $275,000 permanent tax override that is going to be funding their trust each year. The benefit of that kind of funding is that it means that their trust can plan in a way that a lot of trusts can't. because they know that they'll be getting those funds each year. Their CPC also transferred funds that first year. There may be developer negotiated fees. You just need to be cautious about how you do that. And then there are communities that are looking at short-term rental fees, taxes from that, marijuana tax. There's legislation for many communities of having instating a rental estate transfer fee. These are other possibilities that communities are looking at to help fund their affordable housing trust. But it's encouraging to see that communities are actively finding multiple sources and not just relying on one. So we always suggest that when a community is starting out, that you determine your needs, that you have updated information about what's happening in your community and where are the housing needs. Oftentimes you may have a plan that's 5 or 7 or 10 years old, and that data is it's just too old. It really should be updated. And we encourage the trust to move forward with current data and not assumptions or stereotypes or anecdotes, but really have a good sense of where are the greatest needs in the community. And then take some time to set your priorities. Our housing needs are very great, and you're a volunteer board and the resources are limited. So prioritize what are the needs that you're going to be focusing on first. What kind of projects are you going to be funding initially? And you could create benchmarks. You don't need to, but you could create benchmarks. If there's a particular population that you really want to serve, for example, Somerville has a particular interest in serving very low income households. And so they've actually their trust has created a benchmark for themselves of saying that a certain amount of their funds they want to go towards households that are, I think it's 50% of the area median income and below. Not only is it a check for themselves, but it's also a cue. It's telling the community and different entities, developers, and organizations that they have a particular interest in serving very low income housing households. So you don't have to do that. You could do that. And those benchmarks could change as the needs in your community perhaps change over time. How you start out with guidelines or goals or strategic plan, that really depends on the community. And we see all different ways that trusts start out. Some do like Beverly and Brewster, where they create guidelines and goals. It's more of an in-house process. They don't necessarily bring on a consultant. Some communities like Amherst decided to hire a consultant, and they did a more extensive strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan. So it can depend on how much work your community's already done, how recent your housing plan is, how much planning and consultants you've already been working with in the community if people are kind of planned out, or if you really feel like that having a more comprehensive overview and roadmap makes sense. But we suggest having something to get started, and also to be engaging the community to be a part of that. And so something that people can, to better understand what you're seeing your role is in the community. And then this board really needs to be a working board. It can't just be people that show up. It really needs to be people who are gonna step in and help move projects forward. So it takes a dedicated chairperson, someone who knows how to move projects forward and that can keep things going. Trustees that have the time, the ability to show up to meetings so that you can get a quorum, so that you can do work, make decisions. And then the most effective trusts seem to have some kind of paid staff support, whether that's administrative support or whether it's technical to help with certain projects, or perhaps both. But affordable housing is complicated. It's difficult work, and for volunteers to do it by themselves, it's a big ask, and having some paid support is helpful. So if you're considering a trust, we would suggest that you consider, is there a way to also provide some assistance? In some communities, that might be a regional housing service or agency, organization. It could be, in one community, we had a town planner that was a part-time town planner. They created an affordable housing trust and increased this person's hours to support the affordable housing trust. It could be a housing coordinator that helps to support the trust. So there are a variety of different models. And then be explicit with your work, be out there. Don't make it hard for people to figure out who's on the trust. What is the trust doing? What does your ordinance or your bylaw look like? have links to a web page, put your information out there. I would also suggest putting your financial information out there so people know what funds you have, how have you distributed it as well. So don't make it a secret. Don't make it, affordable housing can cause angst for people. It can be controversial. So don't make it hard for people to understand what you're doing and how you see yourself. In some communities, they just want an affordable housing trust that reviews applications and decides whether they're going to fund projects or not. In some communities, and I think an increasing number of communities, the trust is being more proactive and initiating projects. So during this pandemic, this crisis, we've seen quite a few trusts step up and help to support the creation of an emergency rent assistance program. And many of them actually initiated that process. We're seeing more affordable housing trusts be very active in disposing of municipal land for affordable housing. So in some cases, we have a couple communities where a site has been transferred to the trust. In most cases, it's that the trust is involved in the initial feasibility work and writing a request for proposals, reviewing proposals, and helping to move an affordable housing development forward, as well as helping to fund the project. Some communities, they want to do both of these things. So take some time to decide how is your trust going to operate and be clear about this. It's easy to just look at our neighbors, look at other people, other communities in the state and say they're doing X and then think that, well, we'll do that since they are. And we just like to remind communities that you are responsible for your own due diligence. And just because an affordable housing trust is doing something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or that it's even legal according to state law or the statute. So absolutely look around, look at what other communities are doing, see what other trusts are working on, but then make sure that you're doing your own due diligence to make sure that it works for you, that it's appropriate under the statute and law.
Shelly, could I interrupt and ask a few questions?
Yes, please.
Are there any examples where small towns have pooled together to pay for a housing trust administrative support?
Where they've pooled their resources?
Yeah.
So we oftentimes have communities talk about sharing a staff person, and I think that there are very few examples of where it actually has happened at this point. Although there might be an example on the Cape where they're sharing someone. I think there might be a recent example where a couple communities are. So I've heard a lot of talk about trying to do that. It can be challenging to get communities on the same page at the same time. And so there have been efforts that then one community just had to move forward because the other wasn't ready. But if someone on the Cape can tell me if I think that I heard that there is a shared housing coordinator on the Cape at this point, pretty recent. So if someone from the Cape wants to jump in, please do.
Shelly, I'll jump in and just
Okay.
say that that the regional housing service offices, that there are, I don't know, 3 or 4 around the state. Oftentimes they, part of their duties include servicing the trusts.
Supporting trusts.
Yeah, supporting trusts. So there's, one in Sudbury that has, I think, 8 towns, and Reading is the lead on another one. And there's one on the North Shore. So those
And
are
there is the nonprofit CDP on the Cape that is providing housing coordinator type services to communities, and that might include some supportive trusts as well. So there are a variety of different kinds of models that are possible.
Yep.
Great. And another question, can a local ordinance or bylaw charge a trust to focus on 50% or below, rather than leave it up to the trustees to decide or prioritize?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why you couldn't put that into the ordinance or the bylaw. I have actually, I have kind of cautioned against putting that in the ordinance or the bylaw, because then it really restricts you, versus you could have language where it's creating a process for how to define that, but leaving it more open in case you want to be more flexible down the road. So it could be that your community creates a process that it's decided through your through their community development department and the trust, or you could create a process. But if you do put it in the bylaw and the ordinance, then you need to go to your legislative body to change that. So you might want to not put it in so precisely, unless that's just absolutely how you want the trust to operate.
Great. And last question, are you aware of any trusts that require trustees to participate in training?
I think that a lot of them encourage it. I'm not sure that there are any that require it. But, MHP, we offer, I've done so many trainings with new trustees, with a new trust up and that's trying to get up and running. We can personalize that. We've sometimes done it across different communities so that people are meeting each other, their peers across different communities. So MHP is more than happy to work with individual communities or a region or a variety of communities to support you in training. Either these kinds of trainings that are more broad or something that's really targeted to your community.
Great. I think that's all for now.
Great. So because we're doing housing, we are using public resources, we do talk about fair housing a lot at MHP. And I just wanted to bring up a couple different key concepts when we think of fair housing and making sure that our housing efforts are open and fair in our communities and in our region. And two key concepts are disparate impact, or the discriminatory effect, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, or our obligation to fair housing. So disparate impact is that discrimination isn't just if we're intending to discriminate. So it's not just that if we actively don't want to rent to people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community. It's not just explicit. That disparate impact is if the impacts of our decisions, of our housing programs, make it difficult for certain classes, for protected classes, to access housing, that's considered disparate impact, and that's considered a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So one court back in 1976 said the effect, not motivation, is the touchstone, because a thoughtless housing practice can be as unfair to minority rights as a willful scheme. So we need to keep in mind that when we're creating programs and when we're funding housing developments, that it's not just about explicit discrimination, it's also if our decisions that we're making, the programs that we're setting up, if it's making it difficult for certain people, then that's also discriminative. And the other is our obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act identifies it's not just enough to point out that it's difficult for certain people to access housing in our communities, but that we need to be actively working to end residential segregation, to promote housing choice for all people, to eradicate discrimination in our housing markets, and to address disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity. So it's not enough just to identify it, but that we need to be in our communities and in our states actively working to counter these negative impacts. And it gets brought up in communities a lot, the idea of local preference, of that, well, we'll support affordable housing, but just as long as only people that already live in our community can access the housing. And that attitude really flies against the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is about opening up the housing market so it's a more free and open space for everyone. But just to briefly cover that in Massachusetts, the idea of local preference, that this isn't for everything, but it's under Chapter 40B and under the LIP, the Local Initiative Program with the state, that there is this idea that the state will consider some local preference if a community thinks that it's necessary. But it's subject to, the idea of local preference for a specific project is subject to the subsidizing agency's approval. So under Chapter 40B, the entity that initiates the PEL, the Project Eligibility Letter, which is MHP is one agency, Mass Development, Mass Housing, it could be DHCD as well. That agency actually has to approve local preference and the parameters around the local preference. the community has to help show an evidence of need. So it's not that you tell the developer that you want local preference and it's up to the developer. The community has to be able to show that there's a need to have a local preference on a development. In this state, only 4 categories fall under local preference. So it's people that already live in the municipality. It's folks that work for the municipality, people who work for a different entity within the municipality, or the families of children in the municipality. So those are the only 4 categories. So it's not if you want your adult parents to be able to move back to the community and qualify, they would not qualify. Or if you want your adult children to be able to move back to the community, they would not qualify under local preference. And then in Massachusetts, the state only allows a limit of 70% of the units to go towards local preference, to fall under the local preference. And it's only for the initial lease up. So it's not forever, it's for the initial lease up of a development. Are there any questions, Katie, of fair housing or local preference?
Not on local preference, but we did have a question. Is disability infrastructure an example of disparate impact?
Say that again.
Is disability infrastructure an example of disparate impact?
So like not having infrastructure to serve people. Yes, so people with disabilities are a protected class. So if there isn't reasonable accommodations being made in a development for people with disabilities, then that could be seen as disparate impact, yes. And the state is requiring some units to be fitted out for people with different disabilities. So there is some support for that, but certainly not near enough.
Great. And then we also had a few questions come in about local preference,
Mhm.
asking you to clarify local preference. It sounds like it applies to municipal workers. What about local residents?
Yes,
And
so it's people who live in the municipality as well as people who work for the municipality.
Okay, and we have another question. Is local preference an option for units being sold as well?
So for the initial sale, there can be local preference in that lottery process, but not for future turnover.
Okay. And then could you repeat the 4 categories again?
Yep, so the 4 categories. 1 are people who already live in the municipality. 2 are people who work for the municipality. 3 are people who work for other entities in the municipality. And 4 are the families of children in the schools, the municipal schools.
And one more question. Do families of children and METCO program count for local preference?
Yes.
Great. I think that's all we have on that.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna get into some ways that housing trusts and CPCs, community preservation committees, are collaborating and or suggestions for your communities as well. I guess I could say that we have about 115, I think we're up to about 117 or 18 affordable housing trusts in the state. And with this past election, I forgot to check the number for sure, but we have CPA communities. We have so many CPA communities. Does anyone know the number offhand? It's more than half of the communities in the state now, well over half of the communities in the state have CPA. So we have good coverage across the state of both entities. So one is that when we talk about the trust identifying housing needs, the local housing needs, this should not be done in a vacuum. It should not be just the trustees of the trust determining the needs. That this really should be a community-wide engagement. The CPC should absolutely be involved in this. So you don't want the CPC learning about the housing needs in your community when the trust comes to the CPC asking for funds. So a first suggestion is that if you're updating your housing needs analysis, your housing production plan, or any kind of housing, doing any kind of housing analysis, that you make sure that the CPC is engaged in this, that the city council or the board of selectmen, that it's not just the Affordable Housing Committee, the Affordable Housing Trust, the Housing Authority, but that it's a broader process and that the community can also be engaged in that. So there's a baseline understanding of some of the key housing needs in the community. We see that there are a variety of ways that CPCs, community preservation committees, and trusts work together. And the CPA, one of the key things is the CPA can fund the Affordable Housing Trust. So in some communities, the trust is expected to apply for a specific program or a project. So they apply to the CPA, the CPC, in the same manner as everyone else for a specific program or a project. And then the CPC reviews that, decides whether or not they're going to suggest that project for funding. The second is that the trust, in some communities, the trust can apply for CPA funds for no specific purpose, but to have in their account to be able to move nimbly if a project comes up, so that they just have funds there. A third way is that some communities transfer a set percentage each year, and that's generally determined beforehand, and that it may not require an application at all, that the CPC just puts that on the docket of what they're recommending. And that goes to either the city council or the select board, town meeting, that it's a set amount. So it's important, it should be established early on of how are these entities going to operate in your community? How might the CPC fund the trust? So in some communities, Cambridge, they're transferring 80% of their CPA funds every year to their Affordable Housing Trust. And this has been their pattern for, I think, since the beginning. So they really use their Affordable Housing Trust as the community housing arm of their CPC. All housing funding questions go through the trust. In Somerville, their CPC has been transferring about 45% of their funds to their housing trust. So I think developers can still go to the CPC for funding, but the idea is that most of the funding decisions for housing is done through their trust. And then Grafton is an example of a town that essentially transfers 10% of their CPA funds to the Affordable Housing Trust on a regular basis. And there are other communities that are doing that, something similar as that as well. But we talk about grant agreements all the time, as well as for those of you who engage with Stuart Saganor at the Community Preservation Coalition, that we urge communities to be diligent in having grant agreements whenever you're distributing any public resources. And this includes transferring funds from the CPC account to the Affordable Housing Trust. The funds can still be given to the trust for broader purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific project, but you really want to think through, are there any restrictions or expectations that you have for these funds, or how soon they're used, how quickly they're used? Sometimes funds sit in a CPC for years, housing funds, and they don't get used, and then they might get transferred to a trust, and then they just sit there and they don't get used. So you want to make sure that there's, even if you're not transferring the funds for a specific purpose, that there's some idea that that the trust has done some work around knowing what the needs are in the community, having an idea of the kinds of projects that they're wanting to fund, that they have some sort of plan, some guidelines. Because once the funds are transferred to the trust, if your grant agreement doesn't specify the funds being returned to the CPC if they haven't been used in 5 years or 7 years, then the trust doesn't have to return them. So if the CPC has expectations that their funds are used within 3 years, within 5 years, within 7 years, you should write that in the grant agreement. If the funds are for specific purposes, that should be specified in the grant agreement. If it's for broader purposes, you should specify that as well. Try to think ahead, try to anticipate, and put that in this agreement. And that goes for the trust as well. If you have expectations, make sure that that's outlined in the grant agreement so that down the road, there isn't a dispute over the purpose of the funds. which goes into that both entities should be deciding critical elements up front. So how are the boards going to work together and have that idea? Does the trust need to apply? Is the CPC going to allocate funds every year? What does each board need from each other? And a key thing that has come up, can CPA funds pay for administrative costs of the trust? The trust statute allows the trust to pay for administrative help. Is the CPC okay with funds being used towards that? There have been some disputes where that wasn't clear. Make sure that you have this conversation and that you put this in the grant agreement up front. The trust statute requires that your Affordable Housing Trust report back annually to your Community Preservation Committee about how you're spending CPA funds. This is in the trust statute. So every year, the trust must report to the CPC how you've used CPA funds in that year, if you have. And then the CPC needs to be reporting that information in their annual CP3 report to the Department of Revenue to make sure that we're accounting for how CPA funds are being used for housing. Just transferring it to the trust isn't giving us the information that we need. We need to know what the end projects are. So the CP3 report is due on September 15th every year. And the CPC and the trust should have a conversation about when the CPC expects this report from the trust. On this slide on the right, you can see a document. MHP has put together a fillable document. It follows all of the questions for the CP3. This is intended for trusts to use to be able to report to their their CPC. So it has all the pertinent questions. We created this with Stuart Saganor to make sure that it follows the state report. And we also have directions about how to fill it out because you would think that it would be clear, but it's actually, the CP3 report is actually a little bit tricky. So remember that you need to be reporting every year how you're spending CPA funds. And then another suggestion is this, just upfront determining what the different roles are between different entities in the community, to be clear about what the CPC sees its role and its role around affordable housing, to make sure that the trust has clarity around its role and any other housing entities in the community. This is just one example of how Manchester looked at their housing strategies and then which entity is responsible for which. So they identified housing strategies on the left. They determined shorter term, longer term, and then on the far right, they identified their lead board, who was going to be the key board in moving that strategy forward. So not only is this providing some accountability, but it's also helping the boards a little from stepping on each other's toes a little bit by identifying leads on different topics, on different strategies. So I would suggest a similar some sort of similar activity with your CPC, with your Affordable Housing Trust, and if you have any other housing entities, just to be clear of who's doing what. 7, ensure transparency. So be clear about what you're doing. Don't make it hard for people to find what you're doing and who's on your board. Some communities use the strategy of having a joint board appointment between the CPC and the Affordable Housing Trust. That could be a strategy. We warn just a little bit that you just don't want trustees on your Affordable Housing Trust that are on too many boards, because we have found some having a hard time getting a quorum because they have trustees that are just way too busy. So if you are doing joint board appointments, just make sure that it's not someone who's already overwhelmed with multiple boards. You want to make sure that your CPC, your trust, that you're reporting back to each other regularly and including other entities like select board, city council that might also be important. When you fund projects, both the CPC and the trust, if you're both funding projects, promote these efforts, let people know what you're doing, and then use a webpage. So for both the CPC and the trust, and social media if your community does that. But these are just simple ways to get the word out of who you are, what you're doing, and how you're working together. And unfortunately, in I think too many communities, we see competitiveness between the Community Preservation Committee and the Affordable Housing Trust. And it feels really unfortunate. they're both municipal entities. They both should hopefully have the municipal's interest in mind and be supportive of affordable housing, because both have a charge to engage in affordable housing. So instead of competing with each other, try to complement each other's efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing, and really try to center your relationship and your efforts on more housing, more affordable housing. I'll leave it at that. And then lastly, these entities can be working together to create a culture of support for affordable housing in the community. We know that affordable housing can be really controversial. This idea of culture of support, I actually am borrowing it from Connie Kruger from Amherst. She brought it up at a training that we did years ago, and I just appreciate it a lot, where she talked about that they have several entities that are working together to create a culture of support for affordable housing in the community. This is just one resource that you could use. You don't have to live here. You could just Google that and it will come up. And it was an effort between two entities, Enterprise and another entity, where they tested housing messages in the market. So they wanted to figure out what messages resonate with people and what messages backfire. And just some of the things that they found was, when we talk about affordable housing, we really need to balance people with places and systems, to not just talk about the people that need the housing, but to talk about the places, the systems that make it difficult for people to access housing in our communities. To not just talk about them, the people that need affordable housing, but that they're a part of us, that it's our story, the story of us, not just the story of them. We all have people who are lower income in our communities, who are of all different income levels. So it's a part of us. They suggest that connecting housing to other social issues and outcomes, that enhances people's ability to understand the need for diverse housing options and affordable housing. We know that health outcomes and educational outcomes increase when people have safe and affordable housing. And so make those connections, because that impacts the whole community. We know more and more through research that where you live, your zip code does affect your outcomes, and that can be part of the conversation. And then also just consider the language that we use. So this is something I suggest a lot with Housing Trust, that you spend some time thinking about how are you going to frame the conversation around affordable housing? How are you going to talk about it in your community? And they tested through this "you don't have to live here" the words home and housing. And they found that with the word housing, that people, one, oftentimes thought of public housing. And even though we know that public housing is very important in our communities, a lot of people have a really negative connotation to it. Or they think of housing as a commodity. And home was more where they found themselves and where they found their families. And so it could be talking about affordable homes versus affordable housing. I bring up a lot that in the development world, we talk about housing projects, and that's just the language that's used. And of course, when we talk about projects, for a lot of people, that's really negative, and they could hear that you're bringing the projects to your community if you talk about housing projects. And so I try to talk more about housing development when I'm in communities, but there might be some words or language that may be more effective or less effective in your community, and taking some time and being on the same page, the trust and the CPC, could be helpful.
Shelly, could we go to some questions we had regarding that?
Yes, so questions, and then I'm going to ask Katie to highlight if any of you put some examples of how your CPC and your housing trust are working together.
Okay, so I think you addressed this well, but we did have some questions that came up that I'll combine the two. One was about how you create buy-in with how would a trust create buy-in with the Community Preservation Committee, and another person said that their CPC, their Community Preservation Committee, is not open to giving Affordable Housing Trust unrestricted funds. They're doing it by specific programs and projects, and how might they encourage the CPC to give unrestricted funding, if you had any suggestions from other communities?
Mm-hmm. So I think that in some communities that's just the reality, that the CPC only wants to give for specific projects, and there could be a variety of reasons why, and it could be different per community. I think that it's could be that you just need to build a track record with the CPC, that you need to follow their parameters initially and do a good job of apply for something, receive the funds, implement that, report back, and perhaps over time of showing that you do what you say you're going to do, that perhaps then that opens up, builds some trust. Frankly, in some communities, it might take just shifting some of the personalities on the different boards. There's no way you can force it. So I think it's building a track record. It's showing that you're, it's partly why I suggest doing creating some sort of guidelines or goals or an action plan, so that it's clear that the trust has been thoughtful about what the needs are in the community and how you're wanting to address those needs, and have some sort of plan, have a budget of how you're going to use your funds, and then report back on that to different boards, including the CPC. So I think it's being upfront, it's being open, it's reporting back regularly, building a track record. I think this might help in some communities, but I know that in some communities, it's just really difficult. You could perhaps a CPC might be more willing to transfer funds for that are more unrestricted if you have a limit of when those funds need to be used by, or they get returned to the CPC. Maybe that could be part of the conversation, because they are public funds, and if they're just transferred and there's no idea what they're going to be used for or when, maybe putting some parameters on that could help that conversation. So I'll say that about that. In terms of with buy-in, some of it is being clear with the data that you found, the needs that are in the community. You might need to bring in different entities in the community that are influential, that are working on housing or support affordable housing, that maybe those voices can help support the trust with the CPC and with other bodies in the community. So be strategic of trying to find partners that may not sit on the trust, but that can participate in the work in one way or another, or support the work. And perhaps those voices can help with the relationships between the CPC and the trust.
Great. Then we had another question. Given the inflexibility of most town meeting schedules, is it appropriate for Community Preservation Act money to be held by a housing trust just in case an opportunity with short time frames presents itself? For example, an opportunity to purchase an affordable housing home in which the town has the right of first refusal.
Yeah.
And how would reporting on such a fund work?
So that's one of the key points. One of the key reasons to create an affordable housing trust is that you don't have to wait for town meeting. And that could be one of the cases that's made to the CPC, that especially if you're a community where you have an example where a unit was lost because there wasn't any mechanism to purchase the unit before it was lost as affordable housing. So that's one of the best cases to be made, that the trust, that it could be strategic for the community, for the trust to have some funds available in moments like that, so that they don't have to wait for town meeting. And especially if you have an example of where a unit was perhaps lost. But yes, that's one of the most strategic reasons to have a trust and to have funding in the trust account at all times.
Okay. And then are there any requirements that trusts need to hold public hearings at any point during the year? And if this is not required in the statute, could it be in the ordinance?
Yeah, so it's actually not required in the statute. It's not like the CPA statute does require an annual. There are communities like Amherst has been doing an annual hearing, and it's their way of connecting with the community and getting feedback. So you could write something like that into a statute or a ordinance. You want to be cautious about being too prescriptive or requiring too much. But I think that I would encourage trusts to find some way to engage the community, and it doesn't have to be arduous. It doesn't have to be a lot, but I appreciate that at least until the pandemic, that Amherst had been, their trust had been having a fall public meeting where they were actively seeking public engagement and feedback. So that could be a part of how your trust functions and your expectations.
Okay, and then one more. Someone had a question about, and I think you might have gone over this in the determining roles in your community, but if a community has both a housing partnership and a housing trust, what would that relationship look like?
So for some communities, they decide to keep an affordable housing partnership or an affordable housing committee at the same time that they create an affordable housing trust, because they might use the committee or the partnership as more of an advocacy entity in the community. Some partnerships may also, and committees may also have the charge to review affordable housing developments or developments that have affordable housing in them. So they might have that role as well, whereas then the trust is more focused on implementation and on funding. So it could look like that. In some communities, they have a hard time filling both boards. And so we do have the example of Weston, where they decided to absorb their partnership into their housing trust, and they created subcommittees to make sure that all the different activities were still being met, just still being done, but there were trustees and then subcommittees. So there were some people that were on the subcommittees, but not actual trustees of the trust. I believe that's how they've set it up. So, and that's because they just had a hard time filling both boards. So the models are really different, and it can just depend on your community's capacity and what you think is important. A community like Amherst has many different entities working on different elements of the housing needs in the community. So it really is a reflection of the community and how they see what works for the community and the people that are involved on the ground. And I'm happy to talk that through more specifically with any community that might be wrestling with that a bit.
Great, Shelly. I think that's all the questions we have here.
Then that gives you a few minutes if people have been giving you examples of how their housing trusts and CPCs have been collaborating, to give us a few examples.
Sure. Well, we didn't get too many because I think people were just so immersed in your presentation, but maybe as I share the few that came in, more people will put some in the chat. But we heard from in Cohasset at the Springtown meeting, which was held in a parking lot, the $200,000 was transferred from the CPC to the Affordable Housing Trust to help get started. Then we had Donna in Brewster share about how CPC trust the CPC and the trust work together great. She said, we have a CPC member on our trust as part of our trust bylaw. We hold joint meetings and we have a housing coordinator who communicates between both entities. The trust shares housing information consistently with the CPC and invites members to all of our housing forums. We're very lucky in Brewster to have a strong relationship between the trust, the CPC, and our housing partnership. But building those relationships was intentional as a tool to create a better, more broad-based housing program.
So I do just want to point out, try not to get too jealous of Brewster. They are kind of rock stars, but as Donna did point out in that, it did take work and they did a lot of groundwork. They did a lot of relationship building. So it's a great story. Of how to build both of these entities and to get them collaborating.
And I'll just share one more from Tisbury, if I can. The CPC has just begun asking for grant agreements with the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. The CPC asked that the trust fund sign the annual grant agreement prior to the appropriation being transferred to the trust fund. Usually there is an annual request from the town of Tisbury for the trust fund. Tisbury has a committee member on the trust fund committee and works to maintain communication with the trust. It would be, and then they added, it would be great if there was a general training for all members of the town's trust fund.
Okay, any other?
Those were the only ones I saw, but so I think that was it.
Fantastic. So I think it's just the last slide has my contact information, and I meant to put Katie's on. I meant to go back and put Katie's on, and I totally forgot. So Katie is a great support with our team and helping with technical assistance and communities intakes on that. So you know Katie's email if you look at my email, where it's just kbossy@mhp.net if you need to contact. So you should see us as resources if you already have a CPC and a housing trust, or if you're working towards either of those, that we're here to help support you in that. I can help with trainings with your individual community, with across communities, as I said before, and any kind of technical assistance around affordable housing. Our team wants to support your community in supporting affordable housing. So thank you so much for being here today, and I hope that you will join us next week. I forgot to point out that next week's session starts at 11:30. It's not at noon. I made a mistake with that. So it starts at 11:30 and it goes until 12:45. So a little bit earlier. If you signed up and you thought it was noon and you can't come at 11:30, come at noon, but we'll be starting at 11:30 with Ann Lewis from MHP. Thank you so much.